as the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston brings you a conversation about the rise of anti-Semitism around the world with ADL Vice President Sharon Nazarian. Hi, I'm Felicia Chapman, the Senior International Education Manager of the World Affairs Council, and together with the Council's Board of Directors, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program. As always, we invite you to join us for our upcoming programs, including International Affairs Commissioner Adrian Garcia, and I know you won't want to miss the program next week with business leader and philanthropist Bill Gates. Also, don't forget that registration is still open for Academic World Quest International Trivia Competition on March 9th at 4:30 p.m. This is open to all high school students and is absolutely free. So grab a friend or two, or 3 or 4, and come out and enjoy the fun. You can register for all these programs on our website at wachhouston.org. Now, to open our program and introduce our guest speaker, representing the Board of Directors of the World Affairs Council, it's my pleasure to present Will Marsh. Will Marsh is the former Chief Legal Officer of Baker Hughes. In that role, he had responsibility for the combination and integration of GE Oil and Gas and Baker Hughes businesses. Before joining Baker Hughes, Will was a partner with the law firm of Ballard Spahr, representing clients in the areas of corporate governance, mergers and acquisitions, finance, and security laws. Will has also served as a member of the Board of Directors for Alta Bank, the largest publicly traded community bank in the United States Mountain West area during the bank's initial public offering. Everyone, please welcome Will Marsh. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Felicia. And it's an honor for me to be able to introduce Sharon Nazarian with us tonight and have her with us tonight. It's a great honor for the council to have her. Sharon joined ADL in 2017, and she's currently Senior Vice President of International Affairs. She heads ADL's work in fighting anti-Semitism and racial hatred globally, including overseeing ADL's Israel office. And prior to ADL, Sharon was active in 3 worlds: academia, philanthropy, and foreign policy. She's the president of the YNS Nazarian Family Foundation with a regional office in Israel named the IMA Foundation. She's also the founder of the YNS Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, and chairs its advisory board. She taught as an adjunct professor at UCLA in the Department of Political Science. She's a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, and she sits on a myriad of foreign policy boards. She studied across town from UCLA at the University of Southern California, there with double majors there in journalism and international relations. And she received her master's and PhD in political science, also from USC. Sharon, welcome to the World Affairs Council of Houston, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Thank you, Will, so much for that warm introduction. And thank you all for having me join you this evening from Los Angeles. So greetings to all of you in Houston and around the world from wherever you're joining. It's my pleasure to come to you tonight on behalf of the ADL, a 108-year-old Jewish organization founded in 1913 with a tenet from the very beginning to fight against the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure just and fair treatment for all. ADL has a long and illustrious history of battling all forms of hate, and our founding fathers knew from very early on that in order to protect Jewish life in America and Jewish communities, that we had to do it in coalition, in partnership, and with a very loud voice advocating for all vulnerable and minority groups. So when I joined ADL in 2017, I knew that my own personal journey was one that had really led my whole life to bring me to the US and to the ADL. So I'll start by sharing with you a little bit about my personal life. I was born in Tehran, Iran, in the Middle East, to a Jewish family. Jews have been in Iran for over 2,700 years, so we have long lineage as a community in Iran. Our history has been marred with ups and downs, like most Jewish communities around the world, periods of tolerance and acceptance, and periods of intolerance, discrimination, and pogroms, outright violence. I can tell you that my father, who was born 90 years ago, exactly, we celebrate his birthday just a couple of weeks ago. When he was born in Iran, he was born into a Jewish ghetto. And all of you are familiar with the term. Parts of towns and cities across the world designated and oftentimes legally forced for Jewish residents, Jewish citizens to live in. In a very short amount of time in Iran, my father's life changed, and he became a very prominent businessman by the time of the Iranian Revolution in 1979. But yet again, as a Jewish minority with the revolution in 1979, we felt unsafe and insecure and compelled to leave our homeland and emigrate to the US. That's when I came as a young child to the United States. You heard about my educational journey and my work up until the time that I joined ADL. Today, in my capacity as Senior Vice President for International Affairs, I am responsible for the work of ADL everywhere around the world. ADL is essentially a US organization. We have 25 offices across the major US cities, including Houston, and we're very proud to be in your community. And so my team's responsibilities lie outside the US. So my team cover literally the rest of the world, Europe, Latin America, Middle East, Africa, and we're a little bit of Asia as well. And our number one mission is to monitor and to advocate on behalf and seek the security and safety of Jewish communities around the world, and to advocate and speak up on behalf of all vulnerable communities, exactly the mission of ADL. My team just does it outside the world, outside the US. So the way that ADL functions today is through main avenues of work that we do. First and foremost, we use our know-how, our expertise and knowledge to advocate. So advocacy is a very important part of ADL's work with government, with the civil society, as educators, to bring to light issues facing Jewish communities, all minority communities. So within the US, our advocacy is very wide and robust, because for over 100 years, we have been advocating from issues from civil rights to LGBTQ rights to all aspects of vulnerable communities, whether it's through immigration, it's through extremism, it's through monitoring extremist groups. So we continue to do that till this day. Internationally, we bring exactly those same expertise through our advocacy work. In addition, we also bring a lot of programming. We have a very large education department, and therefore we educate our public, whether in the US or internationally, about anti-Semitism. So one of the ways that we really look and formulate both our advocacy work and our programming is by starting with data. And we are a data-driven organization. I'm sharing screen with you because I want to show you where we start. And that's by understanding where the world is today when it comes to anti-Semitic attitudes. ADL is known for the polling that we've conducted for over 40 years. Most of that polling has been conducted in the US. But today I want to share a tool that we have created since 2014, which is called the ADL Global 100. That's what you see here on the screen. And in 2014, we conducted the most comprehensive attitudinal polling ever conducted in 101 countries. And these are all the regions of the world in front of you that you can see. And through this, we were able to determine where are the regions of the world that citizens hold the highest rate of anti-Semitic attitudes. Now, part of the beauty of this tool, and you can have access to this as you do on your own time when we finish with this webinar today, you can do comparative analysis of the kind of polling that we've done in the past and how do two regions of the world that you're interested in would fare. So here I've chosen two countries just to demonstrate for you, one in Latin America, Argentina, and one in Eastern Europe, Hungary. And you will see that we conducted three series of polling tests. The first one in 2014, the most comprehensive one. We followed up in 2015, another series. And then the latest polling that we've done was in 2019. The 2019 countries were not as comprehensive. We did about 20 countries. And the thesis behind that was we really looked at countries where the largest number of Jews lived, so the largest Jewish communities. So as you can see, Argentina and Hungary were part of our 2019 polling. And I want to demonstrate to you a little bit of how we understand what happens in societies around the world. And this index score is a very important tool for us. Essentially, what these numbers mean, based on 11 questions that I will share with you in a moment, we asked the same 11 questions of all respondents. And based on the responses, if 6 or more questions are answered in the affirmative, in a positive, that attitude is considered anti-Semitic. So these index scores represent that in Argentina, 30% of those asked held anti-Semitic views. And in Hungary, in 2019, 42% held anti-Semitic views. I would like to share with you some of the questions that we asked, and these are the same questions that ADL has been asking for over 40 years. And we really use that for longitudinal purposes to show how societies are changing, how they're evolving. Because a very important tenet of ADL's beliefs is that as societies change, when anti-Semitic attitudes rise, whether you're in a democratic country or a non-democratic society, that is the canary in the coal mine. That societies that show rise in anti-Semitic attitudes are headed in the wrong direction, generally speaking. Not only about Jews, not only about the views they hold about Jews, but in general, that societies are becoming less healthy. If they're democracies, their democratic institutions are under threat. The tolerance for the others are being pressured. And therefore, these indicators and these data points are very critical, again, not only for those who advocate on behalf of Jews and Jewish communities, but society-wide. I just share with you some of the questions that we asked and we've always asked, because these are the indicators for anti-Semitic attitudes, according to ADL. And you'll see the numbers on the right. This is, again, keep in mind, this is Argentina and this is Hungary, Latin America versus Eastern Europe. A question that we ask generally, because, and I'll speak to why, is that Jews are more loyal to Israel than to whatever country that they live in. This speaks to the notion of dual loyalty. And throughout history, Jews have been accused in whatever countries we've lived in of being not loyal citizens. We have always, there's been always a pattern of being accused of disloyalty, of being the other, of not actually being citizens that are trustworthy. And therefore, this is a very important question that we continuously ask. And you'll see that in 2019, over half of the citizens of both these countries believe that Jews in their own countries, Argentinian Jews and Hungarian Jews, believe that Jews in their countries are more loyal to Israel than to their own country. Moving ahead, Jews have too much power in the business world. Look at the high number in Hungary, and also even in Argentina. Over half the population and 71% believe that Jews have too much power in the business world. Similarly, in international financial markets, very high numbers. This is a very interesting question, which speaks to what happened in World War II and how communities afterward see Jews and the remnants of the Holocaust. The question asked, do Jews still talk too much about what happened to them in the Holocaust? So this reflects a lack of not only sensitivity, but what opens the door to Holocaust denial, questionings, the facts around the Holocaust, the number of those who perished in the Holocaust, how pervasive it was. So this question really speaks to that. And you see, again, the numbers are quite high. There's a frustration about how much Jews, continue to say we have to be careful that never again, that we don't go there again. Moving along, Jews don't care what happens to anyone but their own kind. Those numbers come a little bit lower. Jews have too much control over global affairs. This is a very pervasive issue where citizens believe that whatever happens, wars or major global issues that take place, it is really the Jews behind it. And again, you'll see here in Hungary, that's over half of the population of Hungary, those asked believe that that's the case. Jews have too much control over the United States government. So no matter where they are, they believe that because of the influence of Jews in the US, they think that Jews have too much control over the US government. Jews think that they're better than other people. Jews have too much control over the global media. This is a very pervasive question as well that comes up, especially in the Middle East and other places. Jews are responsible for most of the world wars. Wars taking place today. This was a lower number in these two countries. And then finally, people hate Jews because of the way Jews behave. So really targeting and blaming the victim. So this is to tell you that the world as we see it today, there are endemic attitudinal challenges that we have, and we at ADL look at trends, and based on our data, also look at global trends that we see happening around the world. And that's most of my viewpoint on the world. And I'll start by sharing with you that what we're seeing happen today in the world are really essentially three global patterns that affect all of us. And what I'll say to you is nothing new. You're familiar with all of them. First and foremost, you know that we are now at a time where there's mass movements of populations, whether it's because of environmental issues, whether it's because of economic issues, whether it's because of political issues and wars. Whenever there is mass movement of people, we have seen over and over and time again that leads to heightened xenophobia, fear of the other. So that's one factor that we think definitely leads to the causes of not only anti-Semitic attitudes, but all forms of hate. Secondarily, we've seen around the world and in our own country, rise in extremist ultra-nationalist political views that have always been there. There never a time has there been that you haven't seen extremist political views exist in our communities, in our societies. But what has happened is the mainstreaming and acceptance of those rhetoric and ideologies in our everyday political discourse. So that is, again, a global trend we're seeing. In Europe, we see it. In Latin America, we see it. In Brazil, in Bolsonaro, with populist ideology. We definitely see it in parts of the Middle East, in Erdogan, in Turkey, holding very similar populist views and ultra-nationalist views. So again, a global trend that we have seen all over the world and in our own country, in the US as well. And then finally, I would say the third factor, which I think, again, unites all of us as a global community, is the impact of technology and social media. While we all recognize the benefits that what these social media platforms have brought to our lives, interconnecting us, bringing us closer in a more intimate way, it is really the negative aspects of social media now and these platforms behaving as megaphones of extremist ideology, of hate, and so forth. So the threat of those platforms and ideology entering into our living rooms, exposing us and our children, no matter where you are in the world, is a huge factor that leads to the rise in anti-Semitic, and I would say definitely all forms of hate. So when you take all these three variables together, it brings us to a place where there's great concern about the health of our societies and about the direction that we're going as an international community. So with that, I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take questions. Please go ahead.
All right, thank you very much, Sharon. And for those of you who are new to the program, I'm Ronan O'Malley, I'm the Director of Programs for the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. I want to thank my colleague Felicia Chapman for a great introduction, and our wonderful board member Will Marsh for opening the program and introducing Sharon this evening. And also I'd like to thank, in particular, Dina Marks, the Senior Associate Director of ADL Southwest, who works right here in Houston, along with her colleagues doing great work in the Houston area and beyond. And Sharon, maybe just, I think we discuss it, people know it, they hear it, they read it in the news. But I think one thing that's important that ADL has done is that you have come up with a specific, and I think comprehensive definition of what anti-Semitism is, because I think it's important for people to realize what it is you're discussing and you're measuring, and also that it shouldn't just incorporate or be seen in terms of anti-Semitic acts, because sadly, once that's happened, it's probably too late, but it's also ideologies and beliefs that are held. So how do you, as the ADL, define anti-Semitism?
So actually, I have to tell you, one wouldn't believe it, but the definition of anti-Semitism is more complicated than we imagine. And we definitely believe that there is no perfect definition. So one thing that I'd like to share with your audience, and again, I'll share screen for a moment as a very important tool, is a guide that we put together at ADL and we rolled out in 2019 called Anti-Semitism Uncovered. And here we really are talking about the most classic tropes of anti-Semitism and what is behind it, issues of power. And this speaks to one in some of the questions that I referred to also in the polling that we do. But here as we go down, we'll see that the definition of anti-Semitism is a complex one. And I'll read it for you so you'll see. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. I'll add that in 2014, 2015, a group of government and civil society experts got together in Europe and created what was called the IRA definition. And this today is probably the most widely used definition of anti-Semitism, because not only because it's not, I would say it's not perfect, but what is very useful about it is the examples of anti-Semitism and how it manifests today in contemporary society. So I'll just go through some of those examples. Denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination. For example, by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor, that is considered to be anti-Semitic. Applying double standards by requiring of its behavior not to be expected or demand of any other democratic nation. Again, this is relevant to Israel. Using symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism to characterize Israel. So this was the newer addition to the definition of anti-Semitism, which not only talks about classic definition, but updating it and including examples that also look to Israel. So again, as a society, we look to definitions. We want to make sure that it's contemporary, it's up to date. Apologies for that. And that we continue to not have a static definition of anti-Semitism, but one that evolves with our societies and the challenges that are brought to us. Oh, Ronan,
thank you very much. Sorry, Sharon. You know, sadly, and I'd recommend it now, and again at the end I will as well. ADL.org is an incredible resource for all the work you all have done for now 100 years, which is incredible. But sadly, the necessity for your work is thousands of years old. You know, we can go back to the time of the pharaohs, the last few hundred years in Europe, obviously very dark years, whether it be in say the rise of nationalism in Germany or the pogroms in Russia. How would you say anti-Semitism today is similar to the root causes, say in the last 100, 200 years that we might expect, say from nationalism and whatnot? And how is it different? You know, maybe blow back to kind of globalization or other threats, or people feeling economically and politically challenged by the upheaval of what's going on in their country.
Hey, Ronan, you pointed to very fundamental factors and variables that have always led to a rise in anti-Semitism. And I would say that in the US today, for example, in 2019, ADL, we do an annual audit of anti-Semitic incidents. actual incidents of anti-Semitism, not attitudes, but actual events. And we found that there were over 2,100 anti-Semitic incidents that took place in the US. And this was a 12% increase from 2018. And it really marked the highest number of on record for the US. So when we talk historically, our ability to measure has definitely improved. So in some ways, we have a better sense of what's happening in our communities today. But at the same time, the variables underneath that lead to those acts have been always the same. We know that economic anxieties have always led to rise in anti-Semitic incidents and attitudes. We know that political extremism coming into the center and mainstream of political discourse has always led to anti-Semitism, whether it was intended to or not, it always winds that way. So an example I'll share with you with the global pandemic that we just all experienced and we're continuing to experience around the world, one of our biggest issues and challenges was, will the economic downturn that has arisen as a result of the global pandemic will lead to not only acts of anti-Semitism, but also attitudes really going up in terms of how Jews are perceived, not just in the US, but around the world. So my team was in touch throughout the last year with every Jewish community around the world, really gauging how our day-to-day lives been impacted by the economic anxieties in their countries. With rise in unemployment, do Jews get targeted? And we know historically they have always done so, and we are fearful that today again that will happen, and we see signs of that in America and across the world.
And Sharon, I know you're obviously the Senior Vice President of International Affairs, and your expertise and your focus is more upon the rest of the world. But as you noted, 2,000 incidents in a certain year in the United States is alarming. I think two of the incidents that obviously would get a lot of people's attention was the horrific massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, when 11 people were killed. And I think similarly, even though only one person ultimately died, we think of the riots in Charlottesville and videos of white supremacists with torches marching through one of the most prominent and oldest campuses in the United States, University of Virginia. It's something you'd imagine from a propaganda film of Goebbels or something like that. Can you talk about, I suppose, what you and the ADL have seen with regards to anti-Semitism in the United States in the last year? And you touched upon it a bit, but maybe elaborate a bit more of what you think the causes are, and I suppose what your concerns are going forward.
So I think, starting with Charlottesville is the right place to kind of look at what is happening in today's America. And, for all of us, that they had a personal trend to it, and for me did. I had not joined ADL yet when Charlottesville happened, and I can tell you that incident, watching it on television, cemented my decision that I need to join the ADL. And I was deciding whether I'm going to leave my other work and really commit my career to the fight against anti-Semitism. And again, as an Iranian who fled my country because of insecurities as a Jewish person, seeing those images on television that day really was heartbreaking. And again, to your point about Pittsburgh, exactly, a year or so later, to have this horrific act of violence against the Jewish community, and to be targeted by the perpetrator because that Jewish community had opened its arms to immigrants and to those who had been welcomed to America in order to give them a new home. They were targeted specifically for that act of generosity and openness for foreigners who are fleeing economic disparity, who are fleeing insecurities in their own homes, and are being welcomed into our country, given the history of immigration and welcome that the US has always had. So the fact that they were targeted in their house of worship because they had welcomed foreigners into America was truly devastating for all of us. And then I would add the third part of that pattern that we're seeing that is so worrisome, and that was January 6th and the siege on our US Capitol. That was not only the largest attack on our democracy, and what we at ADL have called the most predictable domestic terrorist act in US history, because of all the information that we and other civil society organizations had gathered through our monitoring, through knowing what some of these white supremacist groups had already been chattering in their social media posts, in their chat rooms that we monitor very closely. All of these trends that kind of build up to that day of the siege on the US Capitol point to trends that we have to be really cannot no longer afford to close our eyes to. And we can see today in the Congress, the focus on rising white supremacy is front and center. ADL has played a critical role in not only bringing our expert understanding and analysis to it, but advocating and demanding from our government to pay attention to this rising threat. I can tell you that in 2019, ADL and my team developed a really powerful report showing even the interconnectedness between white supremacist groups in the US and those in Europe. And we looked at 5 countries and we partnered with 5 anti-extremist organizations in Europe, in those countries, where we showed evidence of collaboration, of partnership, of mimicking one another and inspiring one another with this extremist and hateful ideology. And I actually testified before congressional subcommittees on that report. And on January 6th, when we saw what happened at the Capitol, all of us at ADL were heartbroken because we had said that we have been raising these alarm bells for at least 2, 3, 4 years with specific data points, with specific information. So the real threat of global white supremacy, global extreme violent right-wing extremism is real. And I would argue that it's not just within our borders. We have to look at it as a global threat. And we have to connect those dots. If you look at Christchurch, the devastation that happened there, if you look at Halle, Germany, the synagogue in Germany that was attacked on Yom Kippur, these are all connected because the perpetrators cite each other's language and words from their manifestos. They are being inspired by one another. When they show their video and live stream their horrific violent acts, they are actually citing one another's manifestos. So this is truly a global threat that faces all of us, and we in the US are front and center. And I hope that our Congress today and our administration, the Biden administration, will give it the real attention it deserves. And it seems to be happening so.
And regards to the report you're talking about, the internalization of white supremacy and the kind of horrific collaboration between white supremacists in Europe and the United States, my colleagues have posted a link to it in the chat, if any of you want to directly link to it there, as well as the global survey, Global 100 survey with ADL and other reports as well. You mentioned the Capitol insurrection. In a lot of ways, it was awful. It was sad to see white supremacists involved. Probably one of the most vile things was to see a gentleman wearing, I don't want to call him a gentleman, but a person wearing a t-shirt that says Camp Auschwitz staff. But perhaps in some ways, to me, what was more disturbing was what happened 2 weeks after that. Is this a topic that's no longer on the fringes? A newly elected Congresswoman, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who sadly won by a large margin, not 10 years ago or 20 years ago, but in recent time, has been promoting through social media the idea of Jewish space lasers being used to set wildfires in California. If you were to look at it initially, I think that's so wild, that's so ridiculous, I don't want to take it seriously, but I think it shows the degree of perniciousness of it. And I suppose also, are you concerned that it's a sign of the normalization and the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism that a sitting American congressman or congresswoman could hold these views?
Sadly speaking, conspiracy theories and their use, again, have been pervasive throughout history. And today, what we've experienced in our country with the manipulation of information, manipulation of facts, and the pervasiveness of conspiracy ideology out there is truly, truly disturbing. And to have a member of our own Congress sit there and use rhetoric that is so blatantly not only false and hateful, but specifically meant to malign a specific minority group in our country is truly despicable. There's no other word for it. But we as a society have to recognize that conspiracy theories grow when there are anxieties, when there's fear, and when we don't have trust and confidence in our institutions and in the fabric, the very fabric of our societies. When we look at the neighbors across the street or even in our own dining table when we're having Thanksgiving meals with our own members of family, and we cannot even have a common conversation about our diverse political views, but yet we accuse one another of disloyalty, and we take the intentionality, excuse me, of the other, whether it's our uncle or it's our cousin or our brother or our neighbor, and we take that difference in political view to a level of dehumanizing one another. That's where we know we're in deep trouble. And I think we in the United States and around the world, actually, I would argue this is truly issue that the divisiveness and the divisions within our societies have become pervasive. And so after January 6th, I would argue that we need to really look for ways to bring our countries together, bring our cities together, bring our families back together. If you're pro-Trump and anti-Trump, that should not be the divisions. If you're Republican or Democrat, that should not be a reason for us not to be able to have respectful disagreements. And that's okay, but not to dehumanize the other, not to say that the intention of the other is maligned, that there's disloyalty, and that we don't love our country in the same way. So we need to really move ahead and say, what are the solutions? How do we bring back our communities from this deep division and cleavages that have now manifested in our cities?
And you have a recent op-ed in the magazine Forward that highlighted another, I think, quite concerning aspect of the research and results that ADL has found in the last number of years related to the Holocaust. I think some people would sadly not be entirely surprised by the fact that there are still Holocaust deniers all over the world. But maybe what's awful is that that number has gone up, and perhaps maybe even worse, a broader emblematic issue of the problem is the level of ignorance of so many people in regards to the Holocaust, either that they don't even know it happened or they don't realize the extreme extent to which it killed over 6 million Jews. Can you talk about your research about the Holocaust and I suppose keeping that alive and educating the next generation? And also the ADL beyond that does work related to genocide across the world and preventing attacks on minority groups.
I'll take both of those because I think those are both very important questions. Number one, about Holocaust denial. And I refer to the most pervasive challenge that our societies face today, and that is the pervasiveness of online hate, right? Through all the social media platforms that we all use, whether it's Facebook or it's Twitter or Instagram, or the ones that we don't use, but extremists use to connect with one another and create communities of hate. That's what we call them, online communities of hate. So with regards to Holocaust denial, unfortunately, while again, that's always been there on the margins and fringes of society, the real threat to us is that this kind of ideology is now pervasive on social media. And not only is it there if you seek it, in fact, the algorithms that platforms use to sell to us clothes that we think we like or vacations we want to take also feed you the kinds of ideology that if you did a search that would go into your algorithm and feed you the kinds of hateful ideology that you might not even have searched for necessarily, but for whatever reason, the algorithms are feeding you that. So in 2020, ADL for the first time, after a decade of partnering with social media companies to come up with solutions to fight online hate, to work together, to use machine learning, to use all forms of technology to take online hate off these platforms, for the first time, seeing that they were really dragging their feet, especially Facebook, which is probably the worst offender of all, we launched a campaign called Stop Hate for Profit. And ADL, along with a number of other civil society organizations, civil rights organizations, launched a campaign to ask all the major business corporations, companies, brands you're all familiar with. At the end, we had over 1,100 major global brands, automobile, pharmaceutical, all the brands that we all use, clothing companies, to take a 1-month ad pause So for them not to purchase ads from Facebook for 1 month and to really hit their bottom line. We knew that unless they saw this concerted effort by organizations like ours and by major companies who are the main purchasers of ads, that they're not going to move. And we were thrilled to see that not only was this campaign the most effective campaign ever held to pressure Facebook to change and actually implement its own terms of use principles that it has, but it changed its policy regarding Holocaust denial. And Holocaust denial became an official factor for breaking Facebook terms of use. And therefore, if somebody now posts things that are questioning what happened in the Holocaust, how many were killed, what violence was perpetrated, then that is grounds for Facebook to shut them down. So there are many, many different venues that we have to use these tools. And we felt that Stop Hate for Profit has been probably one of the most impactful ones regarding online hate specifically. I want to also answer your question about education because that's very important. We have been in the business of educating our communities again for 100 years. We know that we have to make the long-term investments. We have to fight the short fights, the imminent fights through advocacy, but we know that we have to invest in future generations by educating them. And I'll tell you about Holocaust education, which we've been doing for a long time. In 2020, we released research results that showed that students who were exposed to Holocaust education not only were more aware, knowledgeable about what happened in World War II, about the real horrific results of the World War II, but also we found results that in those students, there were higher cases of empathy, there were higher sensitivities to bullying and anti-bullying. And so overall, the ripple effects of educating youngsters from the appropriate age and up to high schoolers about the Holocaust also has the added benefit of sensitizing and educating them about how we have to protect in our own communities, in our own schoolyards. And having higher empathy and higher sensitivity against bullying was a very important indicators for us. So we were really happy to get those results. And we know that Holocaust education has those added benefits to our societies.
All right, well, thank you. And before we turn to our regular questions from the audience, we're just going to open it here with two questions from two of our great interns here at the World Affairs Council, two college students. So I'll let them take it away.
Hello.
Hi, I'm Torrey Camille, a student at the University of Houston. My question today is, what does anti-Semitism look like in America, and how does it compare to the racial issues that exist today in the country?
Hi, my name is Elian, and I'm a university student. In the past few years, thanks to social media, anti-Semitic remarks made by students at universities have been accounted more than ever before. Personally, I think it isn't more. I think that with social media, we're finally seeing it happen now. Previously, you could read about anti-Semitism happening in campuses and dismiss it as not happening in your area or your college. So my question is, what can we do to reduce anti-Semitism within our colleges? Do you think there should be a mandatory education class on respecting everyone's beliefs and faith? Thank you.
Those were two very wonderful questions. Thank you for those. So I'll start with the first question. How does anti-Semitism manifest itself in America today, and how does it relate to issues of racial inequality in our country? And I think this summer, we all experienced not only the turbulence that many of our cities went through after the murder of George Floyd, but also how we view ourselves, whether we're a person of color or not, in our own cities. The common denominator is when we as minority communities feel vulnerable, and when we feel that there's institutional, the institutional makeup of our countries are built in a way that is geared against us. So if you're an African American, whether you get access to the same bank loans that others get, whether you get the same jobs that others get, and I think for Jews today, in very similar ways, it's when you're held responsible if something happens in Israel and something happens on the border with Gaza, and Israel has certain policies, as an American Jew, we're held responsible for those policies. Whether it's, you go to school and on your locker you see a swastika, carved out on your locker door. Whether it is you go into your synagogue and house of worship and you have to have guarded police with machine guns at the door. Whether it's parents who feel just like parents of African American children, when they're in the street, if they're wearing a kippah, visually observant Jew, if the parents feel that their sons or daughters walking down the streets, and if they're the same with parents of African American children, that they will get targeted because of their faith or the color of their skin. So there's a lot of commonalities there that we as communities that we feel vulnerable today in America, that binds us. And in fact, ADL works very closely with our coalition partners within the African American community, Latino community. And today, what we're seeing even in the last few months is attack on Asian Americans. That is just heartbreaking. And you see that Asian Americans are being targeted because of extremist views about whether it's about COVID and where it came from, just pure hatred based on people's ethnicity or racial makeup. So we, communities of color, have throughout history come together, work together, and we need to do it today more than ever. And hopefully ADL is an important partner in that, and we fight on behalf of all. If you look at our Twitter handle, you will see the myriad of communities that we speak up for. And the past 2-3 days, it's been about the Asian American community, as well as the African American community, as well as the LGBT community, as well as all the vulnerable communities in this country that we feel at this point really under pressure and under stress.
And then just maybe could you touch upon, oh yeah, sure.
Sorry, about social media and on campuses. Mm-hmm. Campuses are, and as an academic, as a professor, I have to say that, yes, I'm sorry, I forgot the student's name, that social media has now amplified what has always been there. That is true. And it's actually made it more extreme. That is true. What we're seeing on campuses that do worry us, however, is that because many campuses are bastion of progressive ideals and really are on the forefront of thinking about liberal and progressivism, in those spaces, some of the trends that are very worrisome to us at ADL is where Jewish students are being asked to give up their Zionist or pro-Israel views in order to participate in progressive causes. And that's a trend that we've been noticing now for the last 5 to 7 years. So if you're a student and you're a Jewish student, and let's say you belong to the pro-Israel club on campus, but you also want to join the LGBT club or you want to join the environmental club, there have been many instances where those students have been asked to stay out and not to participate. So there's an exclusionary kind of exclusion factor to Jewish students, making them feel others and making them feel that they have to choose between issues and causes they care about. We saw that manifested also, in the Women's March, the second and third ones, where pro-Israel groups were asked not to participate. So in progressive circles and campuses happen to be that way as well. The classic anti-Semitism happens. You see sometimes fraternities where we've seen, they've had, the Hitler salute, they've used all the symbology, whether it's through ignorance or through knowing, those are there. But the newest manifestation of kind of new anti-Semitism is one that says you cannot be a social justice advocate and be pro-Israel. And you're asked to basically check your Zionism at the door or choose between the two. And that is anti-Semitic. So that's an answer towards campuses. And I think Jewish students today, while on the whole feel that they feel safe and they feel cared for, they do feel that the environment that sometimes they're put in is one of intolerance.
All right, and perhaps just related to that, I know this could be a very long topic, obviously an entire topic unto itself, but maybe for the sake of trying to get to audience questions as many as we can. Related to that, Chris asked, how does the ADL reconcile the position of the national state law in Israel with regards to your work with regards to, I suppose, protecting and recognizing minorities and the rights of minorities all over the world?
So just to start out to say that ADL has been a supporter and believer in Israel as a Jewish and democratic state since its inception in 1948. And since 1948, ADL has strongly advocated for, since 1967, for a two-state solution. Now, as an organization that stands very staunchly and strongly behind the very right of Jews to self-determination and to right to nation statehood, it doesn't mean that there have not been instances that ADL has not criticized Israeli policy, and we will do so. The nation state law that your viewer asks about is one of those examples. It was a set of laws that were passed, some we completely agreed with, but there were parts of that nation state law that was addressing the Arab citizens of Israel. It diminished the role of the Arabic language in Israel, where it had been considered an official language, and it kind of brought it one level down. It put restrictions in terms of Arab citizens and areas that they could live and they cannot live. So that was an example where ADL really came out and said that Israeli policies that we see as detrimental to its democratic character. Israel is a democracy. All of its citizens and its diverse population have to be protected equally. So that was an example where it was stepping away from that. So we called that out. And as well of any instances of policies that move Israel and its neighbor, the Palestinians, away from a two-state solution. We will also call that out. So we believe that the two-state solution between Israel and the Palestinians is critical for the safety and security and dignity of both peoples. And therefore, when we need to, as ADL, to say that policy that was taken by whatever government, that happened to be in power, now it's been the Netanyahu government for a long time, we will share our dissatisfaction or criticism of it. And the nation state law was one of those instances.
Right. And again, just for the sake of time, I'm going to combine two related questions. Diane asks, anti-Semitic attitudes seem to benefit authoritarian leaders. What can we do to counter the use of hatred to garner favor and power? And then related to that, Dorit also asks, what are their priorities for the new administration in national security and, I suppose, combating white supremacy in the United States as politically here and elsewhere in the world?
Right. So I think that it's true that dictators have always have used anti-Semitism as a lever. And it's interesting, Ronan, we just came out a report a couple of weeks ago called Choosing Anti-Semitism. It's focused more in Europe. And we looked at political leaders in Europe who use anti-Semitic rhetoric, not necessarily targeting Jewish communities in those countries, but using it as a lever against their political opposition, as a way of getting more support from their base. So they use like a lot of reference to George Soros you see in Hungary. It's a way to get their base to kind of come and support them. So this is exactly what your audience member is asking about, how those who definitely don't have democratic intentions use anti-Semitism as a lever in their favor. How do we do that? Making sure that democratic institutions are strong and that political leaders don't gain by using anti-Semitism as a political wedge. So when we at the community level, at the city level, at our country level, call those out and make sure that political leaders don't feel that they will get a benefit from it. And in fact, they will politically suffer for those kinds of anti-Semitic use of anti-Semitic tools. That's a very important way. We need to call it out and we need to make sure they don't benefit from it. And then in the US, I'm sorry, remind me again, the second question.
I suppose, what policies would you like to see Biden enact to combat anti-Semitism in the United States? And also, like, for instance, Adina asked about anti-Semitism in Europe. what should the Biden administration do through our foreign policy to combat, the rise of anti-Semitism in other parts of the world?
Right. The Biden administration, as I mentioned already, both Congress, this new Congress and the administration has been really pointing to the threat that we are most concerned with, and that's white supremacy in America. And, some ask, as I'm often asked, which is the bigger threat? Is it Islamic radicalization or is it white supremacy? And that's a question to me that I don't understand. Can we afford not to pay attention to any threat that goes to the very fabric of our society and the safety that we live in? After 9/11, we learned a very difficult lesson about the dangers of Islamic radicalization. After January 6th, we learned a very difficult lesson about the threats and dangers of white supremacy. And that's what we have to keep our eyes on right now. We at ADL started a campaign 2 weeks ago called Protect, and it is exactly about making sure this administration, this Congress, and all of our civil society organizations are very much obsessively focused on how do we deal with domestic terrorism, how do we deal with not only the mainstreaming of the ideology behind white supremacist group that we saw on display in our nation's capital, but how do we also make sure that they are not mainstream in the way that it is hard to then put the genie back in the bottle. And that's where we are today. Around the world, I would say similarly, the threats in Europe especially are even more complex because there's really three waves of extremism coming from the right, from the left, and from Islamists. So all of it today, you see there's still the French teacher that was beheaded in Paris. That was an Islamic terrorist attack. You see the rise in right-wing extremist ideology in the law enforcement, in the police, in the military. In Germany, we see that. Political parties that hold right-wing views, extreme right-wing views, are coming into governments. And then you see in the UK, the rise in extreme left-wing ideology, which is anti-Semitic. Jeremy Corbyn, the former head of the Labour Party in the UK, held very fundamental anti-Semitic attitudes and views, and essentially hijacked the Labour Party of the UK, the home of most of the Jewish citizens of UK. That was their political home, and they had to all abandon that home because they were no longer welcome as Jews. So the threats in Europe are very complex, and it's kind of like a perfect storm from all directions.
All right, and just for the sake of time, we just have one more question, and maybe you can also kind of give some concluding remarks as well. Alan asked, you've talked about it an amount already, but can you discuss the differences between anti-Semitism from the right and from the left? And lastly, I suppose, what would be your kind of party messages to our audience for how we as individuals can combat anti-Semitism?
So anti-Semitism from the right is the classic anti-Semitism we're all very familiar with. And I really direct you to the IRA definition because it really lays it out. Anti-Semitism from the right is open, it's clear, it talks about the supremacy of the white identity and how it views the Jew. What is challenging about anti-Semitism from the left is that it comes from a political space, a political ideology that is couched in sometimes human rights. It's couched in protection and advocacy on behalf of Palestinian rights. But what it does do, not always, but when it does cross the line, so criticism of Israeli policies, when it crosses the line from valid criticism of any government and its policies to anti-Semitism, is when you hold that nation state or its citizens to a different standard than any other country. When you put classic anti-Semitic characteristics on the state of Israel. And again, the IRA definition is very good at kind of clearly laying out. So from the left, it's much more challenging. It's much more complicated to really say, okay, is that really just criticism of Israel? Or is it saying that the Jews don't have a right to exist and therefore that is anti-Semitism? So the anti-Semitism of the left is more difficult to discern, and we have to be more careful about it because there are plenty of people who criticize Israel from a valid perspective. They have every right to do so. But the minute they cross over the line and they say, you know what, Israel has no right to exist, and Jews are the only people in the world who don't have a right to self-determination, that is what ADL would call anti-Semitic.
Then, and in conclusion, I suppose, what would you like the audience to take away? Obviously, politicians have a lot to do, and hopefully they will do. But what can we as individuals do? You note in ADL, a lot of your literature, again, I tell everyone to visit the Anti-Defamation League at adl.org. The need for education, but also if you see incidences or discussions that are anti-Semitic, call it out. If there's something that is concerning that potentially could lead to violence or something, call the police. What do you want us as ordinary Americans to do?
Ronan, I'm going to hire you at ADL. You're exactly right. You said all the right lines. I mean, not only holding our government officials responsible, but being present in our own communities, in our own neighborhoods. And when you see something, whether it's anti-Semitic or hateful in any way, targeting anyone because of their faith, because of the color of their skin, or because of how they worship, we need to call it out. And that's what we teach children in the schools that we go into. We all have responsibilities for one another, and making sure that, the conspiracy theories that have now taken over a lot of our political discourse, we have to be very careful with those and make sure that we don't fall into those traps. We are on this together, and the health of our democracy really hinges on it. So it really takes all of us, and we at ADL are happy to be partners with all the other wonderful organizations in the US, around the world. We're doing our best, and it takes all of us to be knowledgeable about it, first and foremost by coming to webinars such as the ones you're providing for your communities, but also doing at every level of society. We have to be very vigilant.
All right. Well, again, I wanted to thank our board member, Will Marsh, for the excellent introduction this evening, and Dina Marks from the ADL here in Houston for the work all of you do here. And Karen, to you and all of your colleagues in the United States and around the world, thank you all very much for the great work that you're doing. And we definitely look forward to staying in touch. And we wish all of you at home a great rest of the day. And please, if you see something, say something. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Ronan. And a big shout out to Dina. Thank you for having me. Have a good evening.
Thank you all.